1992. Do you remember that year? That was the year grunge conquered the world. MTV played Nirvana every hour, and Kurt Cobain married Courtney Love. The media presented it as a rock and roll fairy tale. They were on the cover of Rolling Stone, wrapped in each other's arms, with the headline Love and Rebel Soul. VH1 aired interviews where they talked about how they saved each other. We, those who lived through that era, believed it. Because they were the voice of our generation, representatives of the rebels, the misunderstood, those who stood outside the system. But the truth was very different. Behind those magazine covers, outside those interviews, when the cameras were off, there was a war. Their marriage wasn't a pastoral love story, but a chaotic collapse mixed with pain, addiction, and violence. Police reports told this story, but the media ignored it. Neighbors witnessed it, but no one spoke. Hospital records accumulated, but they weren't disclosed to the public. And we, the fans, only saw the MTV version, a couple in love, toxic perhaps, but real. Now 30 years later, when the documents emerge, we understand they showed us the fairy tale and hid the truth. Kurt and Courtney's marriage wasn't rock history, it was tragedy history. And the most painful part, maybe they were asking for help, but no one heard. Because everyone wanted to believe in the fairy tale. Do you remember those times? The nights you watched them on MTV? Are you ready to learn the truth now? Before we dive deeper into this story, if you want to discover more untold stories from music history, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. This journey into the dark side of one of rock's most famous marriages is just beginning. The truth about Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love's marriage lives in a file folder. File number SPD 92471KCCL, stored in the Seattle Police Department archives, covering the years 1992 to 1994. Inside that folder, 7 domestic disturbance call reports, 3 firearm confiscation records, 2 hospital referral documents, and 1 draft restraining order, never finalized. On the cover of the file, a note written in red pen not to be leaked to media, high profile. These documents were kept away from public view for 25 years. When they were partially released in 2019 under Freedom of Information laws, the world was shocked. Because the Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain story everyone knew, grunge's toxic but passionate couple, didn't match the reality in those documents. The documents showed this: the marriage was a battlefield. The guns weren't backstage, they were at home. The threats weren't in song lyrics but in the kitchen, the bedroom, next to Frances Bean's crib. And the most disturbing detail: 11 days before Kurt's death, during the last police call, Courtney told the officer this: "If something happens to him, it won't be my fault. I tried to save him." 11 days later, Kurt was dead. But let's start at the beginning, before the police reports, before the guns, before everything fell apart. January 1990, Portland, Oregon. Kurt Cobain walked into a club called Satyricon and saw Courtney Love performing with her band Hole. He was 22, she was 25. By his own account, he was mesmerized, not just by her music, but by her energy, her rage, her refusal to fit into any box the music industry tried to force her into. Courtney noticed him too. Years later she would say, "I knew he was going to be famous. I knew he was going to be mine." They didn't start dating immediately. Kurt was in another relationship, and Courtney was, in her words, too intense for most people. But they stayed in touch, circling each other like 2 damaged satellites, pulled by the same gravitational force. By late 1991, when Nevermind exploded and made Kurt one of the most famous rock stars in the world, they reconnected. This time, nothing stopped them. They moved fast, too fast, everyone around them said. Kurt's bandmates in Nirvana were concerned. Dave Grohl later admitted, "We saw warning signs immediately. They brought out the worst in each other, but they couldn't stay apart." Chris Novoselic was more blunt in a private interview that surfaced years later. "I told Kurt, this relationship will destroy you." He said, "I'm already destroyed, at least with her, I'm not alone." February 24th, 1992. Kurt and Courtney got married on Waikiki Beach in Hawaii. Courtney was pregnant. Kurt wore pajamas to the ceremony. Only 8 people attended. The wedding photos show them laughing, holding each other, looking genuinely happy. And they probably were, in that moment. But moments don't last. By the time they returned to Seattle, reality was already setting in. Courtney was dealing with morning sickness and the physical demands of pregnancy. Kurt was dealing with the crushing pressure of sudden fame, the creative expectations for Nirvana's next album, and the chronic stomach pain that had plagued him since he was 15 years old. They both used heroin. Courtney claimed she stopped when she learned she was pregnant, but medical records and witness testimonies suggest otherwise. The media found out about the pregnancy and the drug use simultaneously. Vanity Fair published a profile of Courtney in September 1992 that included claims she used heroin while pregnant. The article ignited a firestorm. Child Protective Services opened an investigation. Kurt and Courtney's baby, Frances Bean Cobain, was born on August 18, 1992, and immediately the state threatened to take her away. The couple had to prove they were clean, stable, fit parents, but they weren't. Not really. They hired lawyers, went to supervised visits, submitted to drug tests. They got Frances back after a month, but the damage was done. The fear of losing their daughter bonded them together more tightly, but it also amplified every existing tension in their relationship. The first documented police call to the Cobain love household came on October 2, 1992, just 6 weeks after Frances Bean was born. A neighbor reported screaming, crashing sounds, and what they described as a woman yelling death threats. When officers arrived at the house on Lake Washington Boulevard, Courtney answered the door. She was agitated, speaking rapidly, denying anything was wrong. Kurt was in the back of the house and refused to come out. The police report notes that officers observed broken glass in the entryway, a knocked-over lamp and marks on the walls consistent with thrown objects. No arrests were made. Both Kurt and Courtney claimed it was just a loud argument, nothing physical. The officers left after making a note in their report: high-profile couple, proceed with caution, potential media exposure. This would become a pattern now police called chaos observed. No arrests, file closed. The couple's fame protected them, but it also made them prisoners of their own image. They couldn't ask for help without risking public exposure. They couldn't expose each other without destroying themselves. So they stayed locked in this toxic cycle, spiraling downward together. By mid-1993, the police were visiting the house regularly. June, July, August, each month brought at least one call. Sometimes it was neighbors reporting disturbances. Sometimes it was one of them calling on the other. The reports paint a picture of escalating chaos. Shouting matches that lasted hours, objects thrown, doors broken, Kurt locking himself in rooms and refusing to come out, Courtney threatening to leave and take Frances. In one particularly disturbing report from July 23, 1993, an officer noted that both Kurt and Courtney had visible injuries. Courtney had a scratch on her face. Kurt had a bruise on his arm. When asked what happened, they both claimed they fell. The officer didn't believe them but had no grounds to make an arrest without cooperation from either party. That same report includes a detail that would later become significant. The officer observed multiple firearms in the residence, including shotguns and rifles, stored unsecured and accessible. He recommended the weapons be removed but had no legal authority to confiscate them without a domestic violence charge. Kurt insisted the guns were for protection and hunting, though friends later confirmed he hated guns and never went hunting, so why were they there? Some believe Courtney brought them into the house, others think Kurt bought them during paranoid episodes, convinced someone was going to break in. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. 90s. Two people in crisis, arming themselves against threats both real and imagined. The gun situation came to a head on September 7, 1993. Seattle police received a call from the house. This time, it was Kurt calling. He told the dispatcher that Courtney was threatening him with a weapon, and he feared for his safety. When officers arrived, they found Kurt in the garage, visibly shaking. Courtney was inside the house with Frances. Both were questioned separately. According to the police report, Courtney admitted they had been arguing about Kurt's drug use and his refusal to go to rehab. She denied threatening him with a gun, but admitted she picked one up to see if it was loaded because I was scared he might use it on himself. Kurt's statement was more damning. She pointed it at me. She said if I tried to leave, she'd make sure I never saw Francis again. I don't know if she would have pulled the trigger, but I wasn't going to find out. This was the incident that should have changed everything. This was the moment where intervention was possible, where the state could have stepped in, where someone could have stopped the inevitable conclusion. Instead, what happened was this. The officers confiscated 3 firearms from the residence, a Remington shotgun, a Colt pistol, and a rifle. They documented everything, filed the report, and left. No charges were pressed, because Kurt refused to press them. When asked why, he told the officer, "If I do that, they'll take Francis. I can't let that happen." So the cycle continued. The guns were gone, but the violence wasn't. And within weeks, new guns would appear in the house where they came from. No one officially documented. What the public didn't know during all of this was what was written in Courtney's personal journals. These journals, which were partially leaked in 2016 and caused massive controversy, contain entries from 1992 to 1994. They're chaotic, written in different handwriting styles depending on her state of mind, filled with poetry, sketches, song lyrics, and confessional passages. One entry from November 1993 reads, "Sometimes I look at him sleeping and I want him to stop breathing, not because I hate him, but because I love him, and I can't watch him destroy himself anymore. If he died, at least it would be over. The waiting would stop." Another entry, undated but estimated to be from early 1994, he said he's going to leave me. He said I'm poison. Maybe he's right. Maybe we're both poison and Francis is the only pure thing we ever made. What happens to her when we kill each other? These aren't the words of a murderer. They're the words of someone trapped in a codependent nightmare, someone who can see the ending coming but can't stop it. But when these journals were leaked, conspiracy theorists seized on them as evidence that Courtney wanted Kurt dead, that she planned it, that the "sometimes I want him to stop breathing" line was proof of murderous intent. The reality is more complicated and more tragic. Two people who loved each other were also destroying each other, and they both knew it, and neither knew how to stop. As 1993 turned into 1994, something shifted. Kurt started talking seriously about divorce. He consulted with a lawyer in January, not Courtney's lawyer, a different one, secretly. Friends who saw him during this period noticed he seemed more resolved, more focused. He said he needed to get clean and get out, recalled one friend who asked to remain anonymous in a later interview. He said if he stayed with Courtney, they'd both end up dead, and Francis would be an orphan. He wanted to live. He was making plans. But making plans and executing them are two different things. Kurt was still using heroin, he was still in pain. The stomach issues that had plagued him for years were getting worse, not better. He was still terrified of losing access to Francis. And Courtney, sensing that Kurt was pulling away, became more desperate. Friends describe her calling Kurt constantly when they were apart, showing up at the studio unannounced, making scenes in public. On March 4, 1994, Kurt overdosed in Rome while on tour in Europe. He was found unconscious in their hotel room by Courtney at approximately 6:30 in the morning. This is where one of the biggest mysteries in the case emerges. Why did Courtney wait 45 minutes before calling for an ambulance? The Rome incident is crucial to understanding what came next. According to the official story at the time, Kurt accidentally overdosed on a combination of champagne and Rohypnol, a powerful sedative. It was called an accident, and after Kurt spent 20 hours in a coma and then recovered, he and Courtney returned to Seattle. But private investigator Tom Grant, who was later hired by Courtney to find Kurt in the days before his death, claimed the Rome incident was actually a suicide attempt that was covered up. Grant based this on several pieces of evidence. A note was found in the hotel room that read like a suicide note. Hotel staff reported seeing champagne bottles arranged on a table like a ceremony, and the amount of Rohypnol in Kurt's system, according to medical records, was far too high to be accidental. If it was a suicide attempt, why would Courtney and Kurt's management cover it up? The answer is complicated but comes down to image, insurance and custody. If Kurt was officially suicidal, the tour would be canceled, insurance wouldn't pay, and most importantly, Child Protective Services would have grounds to take Frances away again. So the official story became accidental overdose, and Kurt was sent home to recover. But people close to the couple knew the truth. Something had fundamentally broken in Rome. Whatever chance the marriage had of surviving was gone. When Kurt returned to Seattle, he went straight to Rehab Exodus Recovery Center on March 30th, 1994. He stayed less than 2 days. On April 1st, he left the facility, and his whereabouts for the next several days are the subject of intense speculation and investigation. Officially, he went into hiding, staying at various friends' houses and hotels, avoiding Courtney's attempts to find him. Courtney, meanwhile, did two things. She hired Tom Grant to locate Kurt, and she called the Seattle police to report that Kurt was suicidal and had access to guns. This is where the story gets murky and where conspiracy theories thrive. On April 3, 1994, Seattle police went to the Cobain residence and confiscated a shotgun and ammunition. The report notes that Courtney told officers Kurt had bought the gun recently, and she feared he would use it to hurt himself. But here's the problem. If police confiscated the gun on April 3rd, how did Kurt shoot himself with a shotgun on approximately April 5th? The answer, according to official reports, is that Kurt had access to multiple firearms and the police didn't find all of them. But critics point out that Courtney knew about the guns, directed police to them, yet somehow missed the one that would kill her husband 2 days later. Was it incompetence, or was it something darker? April 5, 1994, is estimated to be the day Kurt Cobain died, though his body wasn't discovered until April 8. An electrician came to the house to install security lighting and found Kurt in the greenhouse above the garage. He had been dead for approximately 3 days. The cause of death: a shotgun wound to the head. Heroin and Valium were found in his system. A suicide note was found nearby, addressed partially to his childhood imaginary friend Bada, and partially quoting Neil Young lyrics, "It's better to burn out than to fade away." The case was ruled a suicide almost immediately, but questions have persisted for 30 years. Why was the shotgun found with such force that Kurt's finger couldn't have pulled the trigger given the length of his arms? Why were there no legible fingerprints on the gun? Why was the amount of heroin in his system so high that medical experts claim he would have been incapacitated and unable to operate a firearm? Why did Courtney, who had hired a private investigator to find Kurt because she claimed to be worried about him, not find him herself when he was in their own property? And most significantly, why did she seem so unsurprised when she received the news? Tom Grant, the private investigator, has spent decades claiming that Kurt's death was not a suicide but a murder staged to look like one. His theory: Courtney Love orchestrated Kurt's death because he was planning to divorce her, which would have cut her off financially and given him primary custody of Frances. Grant points to several pieces of evidence. Courtney's behavior in the days before and after the death was inconsistent with someone who was genuinely concerned. She had motive and opportunity. She had made contradictory statements about Kurt's whereabouts, and she practiced writing letters that mimicked Kurt's handwriting weeks before his death. Most law enforcement officials and investigators dismiss Grant's theory as conspiracy nonsense, noting that the evidence for suicide is overwhelming and the evidence for murder is circumstantial at best. But the questions Grant raises have never been fully answered, and the Seattle Police Department has refused to reopen the case despite multiple petitions and thousands of signatures demanding a new investigation. What does Courtney Love say about all of this? Over the years, her story has remained relatively consistent. She loved Kurt, she tried to save him, she failed, and she has spent the rest of her life dealing with the grief and the guilt. In interviews, she has been open about the chaos of their marriage, admitting to fights, drug use, and toxic behavior on both sides. "We were two junkies in love," she said in a 2015 interview. "We hurt each other because we were hurting. I don't expect people to understand, but I know what the truth is. I didn't kill him. I couldn't save him either, and that's what I have to live with." Some believe her, others don't. The tragedy is that regardless of what actually happened in those final days, the truth is that their marriage was destructive, that they both contributed to the destruction, and that Frances Bean Cobain lost her father when she was 20 months old. Frances herself has spoken about this in recent years. In a 2019 interview, she said, "I don't know what happened in those final days. I was too young to remember. But I've read the journals, the police reports. All of it. My parents were sick. They were addicts. They loved each other and they destroyed each other. Neither of them was a villain, and neither of them was a hero. They were just two broken people who couldn't fix each other." The legacy of Kurt and Courtney's relationship extends beyond their personal tragedy. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of codependency, about what happens when two people with severe addiction and mental health issues try to save each other instead of saving themselves. It also exposed the failures of the system, the police who saw the warning signs but didn't intervene, the music industry that profited from their chaos without offering real help, the media that turned their suffering into entertainment. If you lived through the 90s, you remember the way their relationship was covered. Sometimes it was romanticized as love among the ruins. Other times it was sensationalized as rock and roll's most toxic couple, but rarely was it treated as what it actually was: a domestic violence situation that escalated over years while everyone watched, and no one effectively intervened. The police reports now available for public review show a clear pattern of escalation. Arguments became fights, fights became violence, violence became threats with weapons, threats became a death. Each call to the police was an opportunity for intervention that was missed. Each time officers left without making an arrest, without connecting the couple to resources, without treating the situation with the seriousness it deserved, the likelihood of a tragic ending increased. 30 years later, what have we learned? In some ways, a lot. Domestic violence is taken more seriously now than it was in 1994. Mental health and addiction are discussed more openly. The stigma has decreased, though it hasn't disappeared. There are more resources available for people in crisis, more awareness of warning signs, more understanding that fame and money don't protect you from suffering. But in other ways, we haven't learned enough. We still romanticize toxic relationships in music and pop culture. We still treat artists' pain as entertainment rather than as a cry for help. We still watch people self-destruct in real time on social media and do nothing but comment and share. Kurt and Courtney's story should have been a wake-up call, but instead it became a legend, a myth, a story people tell about the way things were back then without recognizing that the way things were back then is still in many ways the way things are now. If you or someone you love is in a relationship that looks anything like what Kurt and Courtney had, minus the intense highs and devastating lows, the addiction, the violence, the feeling that you can't live with each other, but can't live apart. Please understand this. Love is not supposed to destroy you. Love is not supposed to hurt like that, and you cannot save someone who doesn't want to save themselves, no matter how much you love them. The final word should belong to the people who knew them best. Dave Grohl, Kurt's bandmate in Nirvana, said this in 2002. Kurt talked about being bisexual in the 80s, when the rest of us were too scared to even think about it in the 90s. He was brave in ways people don't remember, but with Courtney, he wasn't brave. He was scared. He loved her, but he was scared of her, and he was scared of losing Frances. That fear paralyzed him. Chris Novoselic added, "People want to make Courtney the villain, but that's too simple. They were both responsible. They fed off each other's worst impulses. Could Kurt have survived without Courtney? Maybe. Could Courtney have survived without Kurt? She did, so we know the answer to that. But together, they were gasoline and matches." And finally, Frances Bean Cobain, the daughter they both loved and fought over and ultimately failed, said this: "My father was a sick man, not a bad man. My mother is a complicated woman who did the best she could in an impossible situation. I forgive them both. I hope someday the world forgives them too, and more importantly, I hope they found peace." Whatever the truth is about those final days in April 1994, suicide, murder, accident, conspiracy, the larger truth is undeniable. Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love's marriage was a tragedy, not a romance. It was a warning, not a love story. And if we keep romanticizing it, keep turning it into myth, keep ignoring the very real pain and violence and suffering that defined it, then we learn nothing from their story. And 30 years from now, we'll still be telling the same story about different people, wondering why we didn't see the signs, why we didn't help, why we just watched and did nothing.